right, I'm Brenden Smith. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for FirstBank. It's a bank based out of Colorado. I've been the CISO for about 15, 16 years at this point. So we're going to talk about a 3-year-long red team engagement and what that looks like. So first, a disclaimer. I'm sure you all have seen it plenty of times at this point. The only thing I'll briefly note is that I try not to mention the vendor I use here because I think everyone should go out and evaluate their own vendors and not take my word for it. So if I slip up and use that vendor's name and you go find them, just remember that this disclaimer says you should do your own due diligence. So friendly reminder. Okay, so we're going to be talking about red teams. So to start off with, I wanted to kind of get us all on some consistent terminology here. So I'm going to be using the NIST definition for a red team. It's the one I prefer, at least in the context of this presentation. But it's basically a third-party contractor, right, you've engaged to try and break into your organization and simulate an authentic adversary, primarily so that your blue team or your defensive team can respond to that adversary authentically and you can learn something from that engagement, right? So they want to demonstrate the impacts of successful attacks, and you want your blue team to see what actually works in terms of your defensive controls and how that plays out. So that's the definition I'm using for the purposes of this presentation. Okay, so a little bit about our red team history. So this kind of looks like a maturity model, but I would encourage folks not to use it because I think everyone's path to maturity here looks a little bit different. But this is the path that we followed. So probably about 10, 12 years ago, we were using primarily ad hoc practices. So we would occasionally go out and do some different testing. We might do some port scanning here or there, but it really wasn't much of a formal process to our program. And obviously that's not going to work for very long as you mature as an organization. And today we're a $30 billion bank, so we had a fair amount of maturing to do when we were, I think, a $9 billion bank when I first started. So we then started vulnerability scanning, right? So we purchased a product, we started doing vulnerability scans of our entire environment, and that creates a ton of noise, right? You kind of have this hockey stick effect in terms of vulnerabilities that you discover inside your environment. So it takes kind of a couple of years to work through that process and mitigate some of those threats and better understand kind of what your landscape looks like. But at some point there, you hit a level of maturity where things aren't surprising anymore. Things kind of hit a pretty manageable pace. You're not discovering a whole lot that's new, and the practices are sound. So from there, we started to do penetration testing, right? We still wanted to get better. We wanted to better mature our program, so that seemed like the right option for us. We paid a firm. They came in, they sat down with our folks, kind of side by side with the blue team, and did some testing of the environment to see what they could find. Similar effect, right? For a couple of years, this was pretty eventful for us. They found a lot of different things. There was a lot of mitigation and remediation we had to do. But eventually, you hit that point of maturity again, and these tests really weren't resulting in anything interesting. So around this time, probably 2 or 3 years, or 4 or 5 years ago rather, we started to bring in red teams. And so we wanted to, at this point, start to exercise our defensive team, the blue team, to see how they would handle real attacks. So we engaged different contractors. We tried a bunch of different companies, some big names, some names that are in the vendor expo, and some small names as well. Some of them were successful. None of them were able to really show us, I thought, what an authentic attack looked like. For the most part, they were getting caught by the blue team within a couple of hours of starting engagements. And then from there, we had this 2-week contract with them, and really, sometimes they had some success and we learned some things, and most of the time they didn't. And so pretty quickly we realized we wanted something a little bit different. And so that's what brings us to continuous red team, which is the point of this talk. So why shift from traditional red team exercises? Real attackers aren't on a 2-week contract, right? So I think most of us, if we're bringing in a red team to try and breach our organizations today, it's probably on a 2-week contract, maybe a month long, right? There's some variance in there depending on what you're doing. But that's not a real limitation of the attackers that are trying to break into their environments. They can spend months or years targeting us, waiting for us to make a mistake in our practices. And so they have a long time to come after our organizations, and that's very difficult to emulate in a traditional red team exercise. So how do we construct a test that more effectively kind of simulates that? And then traditional red teams, right, they're constrained by rules of engagement. There's things they're not allowed to do. There's things that they just don't have the time to do simply. And so those are some of the limitations from my perspective of these kind of traditional tests, right? They can still be useful depending where you're at in terms of maturity, but for us, our needs have changed. And then this is straight from CISA, PRC, state-sponsored actors, compromise and maintain persistent access to U.S. critical infrastructure, right? We see these headlines all the time in the industry now, where attackers have spent months or years inside an organization waiting for the right time to do whatever it is their objective happened to be, or similarly, they're taking months or years to break into a target organization because there's a ransom payment on the other end or something similar to that effect. So you're not going to be able to read this, but I'll read some of it to you. This is a screenshot from Dark Web Forum. It's kind of like a Reddit clone, and these dark web knuckleheads could talk to each other, ask questions. So this is a guy that had compromised a bank account, and he's looking to steal the money from the bank account. And he's not the most sophisticated person in the world. He was able to compromise the bank account, but he doesn't know how wires work. So he's in this forum saying, hey, can someone help me? How do you send a wire from a bank? And this person here is advising them, saying, hey, it's not much different than doing a regular wire transfer. You just have to pretend to be a victim. You have to have a social engineering component behind it. But if you really don't know how to use a wire, or how to send a wire rather, use a search engine, but just not Google. So even the dark web knuckleheads care about their privacy, I guess. But the point of this is that the attackers that we're faced with in the real world, right, they're willing to be patient, they're willing to do the research. Even a really, really clumsy example like this, they can take weeks or months to learn how to conduct an attack against our organization. So as defenders, we have to be better prepared to deal with that type of threat. Okay, we're going to continue briefly down our dark web journey. So this is from another dark web website. They sell a whole bunch of things. I imagine there's a lot of things on this slide that get your attention. The pre-shredded currency that's available for sale for whatever reason. The hand grenade that's available for sale. This being the dark web. If you went out and paid $385 in cryptocurrency, would you get a hand grenade delivered to your house? I'm not sure. They had an FAQ page. They talked about how they shipped these things, so who knows. But that's not really why we're here. So I'll direct your attention away from hand grenades to this. So these are 2 zero-day exploits that were available for sale in this dark web forum. Now, the price on these was $1,500 in cryptocurrency for a Facebook zero-day exploit and about $2,500 cryptocurrency for a Gmail zero-day exploit. They didn't go into a lot of depth as to what this zero-day exploit actually meant, right? But the larger point here is that if you're someone, a criminal threat actor, looking to break into an organization, you don't have to be the most sophisticated adversary in the world. You just have to have resources available to you to go purchase the access you need to breach an organization, right? So if you spend $2,500 and your goal was to break into one of our organizations, there's no rules of engagement, there's no legal constraints for these threat actors, all these limitations that red teams have. They can just go buy it and potentially get into organizations. These are 2 really simple examples I found just very quickly searching, but we've all heard about much more significant examples existing out there, right, for sale on the dark web. So authentic attackers can do these types of things to us, and we need to be prepared to defend against them as defenders. So how do we keep learning? For us, we engaged a red team on a continuous basis. 24/7, 365 was permitted. So they were pretty much never attacking us 100% of the time, but it was an option for them anytime, right? So if we made a mistake, we had a misconfiguration on our perimeter, we could be breached by the red team at any point during that engagement. And they were looking for those things through continuous monitoring. We allowed them an open scope, except the mainframe. I've taken down the mainframe enough times in my career. I don't need to do it again with a red team. So hey, debate the merits of that at some other time, but I did want to be fully transparent with you about how all this went, so we did not allow the mainframe for our particular test. But otherwise, everything else was open to them. We then challenged the red team to simulate high sophistication threat actors, right? So we really wanted something that more closely aligned with the threats we were seeing in the industry, as opposed to a brief engagement where we maybe got some value, but maybe not. Okay, so starting the red team. So the first 0 to 6 months is kind of where we're starting here. So initially, we asked the red team, let's have you be authentic, external-only attackers. We're not going to cede access to the internal environment yet. We just want to see if you can breach our perimeter, if we're making any mistakes that you can capitalize on from the outside, right? So average time to break into an organization for this particular red team was somewhere around 84 days. And as a spoiler alert, they've never been able to break into us from the outside. Now, initially, it's going to sound like I'm bragging, but I promise you by the end of the presentation, you'll know that I'm not bragging, because there's other things that are a little more exciting for the red team. So initially, we started to feel pretty good. We felt like they couldn't get past our perimeter controls. We felt like we were doing the right things. But we did give them 6 months to try that, and so it was a long period of time. And then if you like weird AI-generated art, most of my art in this is AI-generated, so brace yourselves. All right. So 6 months of testing, no compromise. It doesn't necessarily mean we didn't learn anything, though. There were some interesting things about this. One of the things was that a targeted and coordinated campaign against our environment was totally undetected by our blue team. So someone was phishing, they were doing perimeter scanning, they were looking for vulnerabilities and exploits on our perimeter, and we didn't put it together as a kind of single campaign against us. And so that was kind of insightful for the team in the sense that you know, we had hoped that we might have the ability to do that, and we haven't been able to authentically test that any other way other than with real attackers, and then it's kind of anyone's guess at that point. So we were learning stuff already, even if the red team wasn't having much success. So then we opted in this idea of validated control and seed access pass control. Our goal here is to learn from the red team engagements, not to necessarily just make ourselves feel good about them. So we decided that when the red team ran up against an obstacle, we would say, confirm that it had been successful, our defensive control worked appropriately, and then we would seed access past that. So that brings us to a point of facilitated access. So basically what we did is we deployed a point of presence device. So this was a device provided to us by the red team. The idea would be we plugged it into our internal network. It would allow them remote access into our internal network as if a device inside the environment had been compromised or an end user had been phished or something to that effect, right? So we've obviously ceded some access to them. This is stretching a little bit the authenticity, but again, the goal here is to learn. So we put this point of presence device in a desk inside a tissue box. So it was super sketchy. So thank you, AI Art, for the point of presence device in a tissue box. So the idea being here, right, we want to validate controls, as many controls as we can as part of these engagements. So what did we learn from this particular experience? The first piece of it is human beings, right? Would someone actually notice this thing sitting on a desk? We put it in a cubicle that was in an unused part of our office space. This was during COVID times, and so there wasn't a lot of employees actually in and around the facility. So we're really curious if our training had paid off in terms of physical security. And someone did notice it eventually and reported it to the security team. We'll touch base on that in a minute. We validated NAC. NAC appropriately blocked the access. It didn't recognize the device. That was great to see. We then bypassed that for the red team, again, because we want to learn from this engagement. Physical security, would someone actually report it to us? The answer was yes. One of our tech support employees found the device, thought it was really weird that it was inside a tissue box. They unplugged it and brought it to the security team. So that was great to see and a validation that we found beneficial. So a couple of lessons learned. The POP was detected, point of presence device was detected and removed by the technical support employee. So good, some of our training is working correctly. However, it took about 2 to 3 months for that employee to find that. Again, unused part of the building during COVID times, not too surprised by the timeline there, but during that time, the red team was doing active scanning of the internal network. They were going very low and very slow at this point to evade detection because they were really kind of, they were 6 months in and they didn't want to burn the first access right to their internal environment. But we didn't detect that. That was totally undetected by the team. The other interesting thing is that during this period, the threat actor hadn't found a lot of targets inside the environment, so they were kind of scratching their heads at what to do. They wanted to achieve lateral movement and get off this point of presence device. So one of the things they did is they started to purchase target hardware for research and development in their lab. So they identified an attractive target, in this case, a webcam. And they went out and purchased one and started to build a zero-day exploit against it in their own environment without having any access to our internal network. So then they were able to use that inside of our environment. So the first and only time we saw this device exploited was the first and only time they ran the attack against it, right? So your opportunity to catch that as a defender is extremely limited. So not something we've ever seen in any other red team exercise, but certainly a very interesting lesson to see play out. And if you're thinking that's a weird placement for a webcam, that's our boardroom web camera. So if you want to have a really awkward conversation with your board members, tell them that the camera sitting 2 feet to the left of them is the one that's been hacked and is recording conversations. So that was an unpleasant thing, but the red team kind of had an interesting success story there. So if you're thinking to yourself, hey, maybe that stretches the credibility of this a little bit, you know, would someone really go out and buy hardware just to develop an exploit outside of my environment to attack? I would suggest yes. If you're not familiar with this photo, this is from Evil Corp. They're the organized crime group, right? They are sitting on an estimated $100 million in stolen funds from extortion, ransomware payouts, and other things. And it's estimated they own about $4 million worth of cars. So if they have money for $4 million worth of cars, I suspect that they have the money to go out and buy targets and do this kind of research against environments like our own, especially if they have a $22 million ransom payment sitting on the other side of things. So I would suggest that, yes, this is something that we could see as defenders that we have to be prepared for. So we were already kind of getting the validation we expected in terms of the red team. Okay, so progressing. We're about 9 months into the engagement at this point, right? So we're going to reset and restart facilitated access. They've been detected functionally because someone unplugged their device, but we're here to learn. We're here to stress the blue team. We want to see how we do in active attacks. So we re-provision that access and we seeded access to the environment again. So, seeded access, point of presence deployed. They go about and they start doing the scanning again. Again, very low and slow, not detected by the security team again. They're being very careful not to lose the access that they had. So, same kind of pattern, one of the things they found was a different IoT device that was also susceptible, and they were able to develop a zero-day for it and exploit it. And so, that's kind of how we were feeling, and myself in particular, because I had kind of a foot in both things. I could see what the red team was doing, because I had to manage kind of the relationship, and then I was seeing what my internal teams were doing, and this was totally missed, right? So finding and detecting these zero-day exploits is really, really hard. And they had access to another IoT device that unfortunately I can't share because it's under NDA. Then I think probably most interesting at this point is that they went totally silent. So they stopped all activity. They compromised that device. They had a little bit of lateral movement into the environment, and they stopped all activity for a month to make sure that the security team hadn't detected them and wasn't going to detect them. They wanted to put some distance in between the logs from those two events, which I think is one of the key differences in this type of engagement, right? This engagement style affords them the time to be patient and conduct these types of attacks and make sure that they're not caught functionally. So our scanning detections really weren't sufficient, but hardening and patching was. So they weren't able to compromise servers, desktops, any of the things that we were routinely patching. It took an IoT device and a zero-day exploit for that first lateral movement. So in terms of layers of controls, we were feeling somewhat good that we were doing a lot of the right things, but there were still things we were clearly learning from the red team engagement. One of those was that the attacker was intentionally targeting IoT devices to evade EDR. And this is a pattern we see being repeated in the real world. This is becoming, I think, more and more common. Attackers are correctly inferring that a lot of us have invested a tremendous amount of funds into defending our endpoints, right? So if they can not touch those and stick to IoT devices, all the better. So we got to see that play out in real time for us in a very authentic way. And again, this engagement style affords the red team the time to be patient, right? They can be patient, they can take their time and avoid getting caught, which makes it very, very difficult for the blue team. One just brief aside is that during this time period, Log4j came about, and so one of the really interesting things from my perspective was talking to the red team. They were trying to build an exploit for Log4j, same as a lot of people on the internet at that time when it was first released, and we were trying to mitigate it on the other side. And so I got to see that race between the red team and the blue team in terms of who would deliver it first. The red team was in constant communication with us because they are our partner, right? They do care about our security, but we gave them full go-ahead to breach that if they could faster than the blue team could patch, because it would give us a real indication of how authentic attackers were doing as well. The blue team won out on that one, but a really interesting dynamic to see that race between the two and how it played out. It was very, very close, a matter of days before they had functioning exploits. So, kind of an interesting aside. Okay, that brings us 12 to 24 months in, period I think of as threat hunting. So the red team kind of got frustrated at this point. They had been in the environment for a long time, but they really hadn't accomplished any significant objectives. Sure, they had been on a couple of IoT devices, but they really hadn't allowed them to do much. It was interesting, but they hadn't been able to do much in terms of kind of achieving objectives that threat actors prefer to achieve. So they ramped up their activity. They got a lot more aggressive with their scans. They hoped that our scanning detections wouldn't catch them because they hadn't to date. But finally they did. So the point of presence device was detected through Splunk, right? Some of the Splunk detections enabled that. And they were able to remove that point of presence device, so functionally removing most of the red team's access from the environment. They were, however, not able to find the compromised IoT device. Basically, investigating 0 days is really, really hard, right? So time to detection on this was 102 days. It's a long time for them to be in the environment. The good news is that they didn't accomplish any of their objectives, but it felt uncomfortable, right, sitting in my shoes in terms of how long that had taken. All right, so again, we want to keep learning. We want to keep stressing the blue team. So they had had a success. They had detected the red team, removed that point of presence device, but we want to keep doing this. We're going to start again. So we retooled and reset the red team. They took their lessons learned. We put their point of presence device back in again in a different part of the environment to again kind of simulate that seeded access. This time, however, our teams have gotten a little bit better. They were very frustrated by the first round of things. They were frustrated how long it took them to catch the red team. So a lot of our folks spend a lot of time educating themselves and really trying to step up their game in terms of detection capabilities. So one of my folks adopted some research that was published about statistical anomalies in DNS and integrated it into a rule in Splunk and found the compromised IoT device through that analysis. The team was never able to discover how the 0 day actually functioned or when it was exploited, but they were able to identify that it had been compromised. So a huge win in terms of the blue team responding effectively. And again, investigating 0 day exploits is really, really hard. So time to detection here, 44 days. So we're getting a little bit better at this point. The teams have spent a lot of time looking and understanding how to better detect threats, and so I think they were improving at this point. Again, my weird AI-generated art, when I had someone review this, they said it gave them the ick. So if you feel that also, you are not alone. But I liked it. It's kind of a cat and mouse thing. So the blue team's feeling a little bit good about themselves at this point. So we kind of enter this period with the red team where for several months, both groups were trying to up their game, right? So the red team has been detected a few times. They're trying to get better. They keep reworking their scanning attempts or trying to move laterally. And they're taking different approaches, but they keep getting caught by the blue team. And so we enter this cycle where both sides are quickly catching each other and retooling and trying again. And our time to detection at this point dropped to about an hour. So within an hour of the red team starting activity, even using different methodologies, different approaches, and different behaviors, we were able to catch them pretty effectively. So really exciting to see that progress in the teams. We went from about 100 plus days to detection to about an hour. So huge win for the teams and a good kind of outcome from our perspective. Okay, so we're about 2 years in, including with seeded access, and the red team has not achieved any substantial goals. We basically considered that a win. Would we have liked to have detected some things faster? Absolutely, but we were improving, and our layers of controls were effective. And I think the thing that makes them the most effective when I think about layers of controls is that it really buys you time for an attacker to make a mistake. So where we've ended up feeling is that we need enough controls so that we can capitalize on the first mistake an attacker makes. They can be perfect for a long time, months or even years in fact, but if they make a single mistake, we need to be in the position to take advantage of that because we can still be successful in the engagement and the defense of our environment. As a brief aside, deception systems work really well. Deception systems are honeypots. We have them deployed now throughout the environment in response to things we learned in this red team engagement, and they are very, very difficult for the red teams to avoid. So we felt like that was a good outcome as well from the test and something that we learned. Okay. Persistence pays off. So when I told you I wasn't bragging in the slide with the wall, this is where that comes into play, so just remember that. Okay, so the red team's access had been fully removed at this point. They no longer had access to the environment as a result of some of those detections that the team had gone through, but their knowledge was better than ever. So they at this point spent close to 3 years learning our environment through different attacks and different attempts to breach our organization. And they knew a lot about our environment that they had learned in bits and pieces. And so that's something that's really hard to capture in traditional red team engagements. You can use the same vendor year over year, and they may retain some of this, but their knowledge of our internal environment had become impressive at this point solely through these attempts. So what that means is they knew exactly what they wanted to do when they regained that access to the environment. So one of the things they did is, and that's probably just a little bit hard to read, but the red team was basically going through this process of throwing kind of spaghetti against the wall in terms of attacks in the environment and seeing what the blue team did in terms of detection. And the purpose of this was to reverse engineer the blue team's rules for scanning detection because they wanted to do, they had something in mind, right, and they really didn't want to be caught. And so is this an authentic approach that emulates an adversary? Maybe not. Maybe it is. It's a little bit hard to say from my perspective, but it was something that we thought was beneficial in terms of, again, stressing that blue team so that we can learn from the engagement. So we kind of went along with it. Okay, so they put together an attack using the insider knowledge they kind of gained through that spaghetti at the wall kind of approach. They targeted the same IoT device with another zero-day exploit. These IoT devices were hard to remove in our organization for one reason or another. There's a big push to go smash them all with a hammer at the moment, and so we pulled back on that a little bit because they are necessary. But so we couldn't remove them, so the red team went after them again with the zero-day. They used the knowledge they had gained in that kind of loud attack they ran against us to go very, very quiet this time around. So they really slowed things down, and so they were very deliberate in their strategy. And this takes place over a course of a couple of months to give some context for how this had gone. And again, is this realistic? I'm not sure, but it was necessary, and I do think some threat actors externally probably do emulate some of these behaviors, right? Loud noise followed by quiet periods where they're actually doing more sophisticated things. So we went with it. All right, so what did they find? They found an Exchange server, fully patched, that was internal to the environment. It had no external email access. So from the internal IoT device, they actually targeted this as an open mail relay. And the way that that was useful to them was that they did some phishing. Because it was an Exchange server inside our environment functioning as an open mail relay, it avoided all of our external phishing mitigations, right? So you put external in the subject line, you do analysis or whatever else it may be, it avoided all of those things. And so the phish they constructed was this one. It's basically a clone of an error message about an email. It says, hey, to recover your document, please click the following link. And it was basically, if you clicked the link from inside the environment, it grabbed a copy of your net NTLM hash, right? 3 years clicked, including one who wasn't targeted. So thank you for people for forwarding. So it's fantastic. I don't know if this is good or bad news. Only one NTLM hash was crackable. Unfortunately for us, it was a tech support employee, not the one that caught the point of presence device, a different one. So, but one was crackable, right? So they phished inside the environment. They bypassed all of those controls that we expect. And so our employee's guard was down already. And this is a pretty convincing phish, especially if you're in a technical role and you think a script had gone wrong or something similar. Okay, so they had a cracked credential at this point. So they started to do some Active Directory enumeration. They ran a second phish, targeting our high-value admins, right? So they used what they learned about Active Directory to go after more significant roles that they thought were more beneficial to them. They targeted, I think, somewhere between 20 and 30 people in this particular attack. And when someone reported it, so one of our employees identified it, they thought it was real strange, they sent it over to the security team. This employee had an incredible amount of rights, so we were really glad that they caught it. So the security team investigated at this point, but they couldn't reach a resolution. They really couldn't understand what had happened here, and I think in part because they were operating from an IoT device and they'd used a zero-day exploit to get there. So very difficult to investigate. I think a good win from my team, though, is that they knew they were out of their element. And so one of the things that they did is they came to us and said, hey, we've investigated this for a long time. We don't understand how this phish came through. We know they used this open mail relay, but that's about all we can determine, so we think we need help. And they wanted to activate our incident response retainer. I was really glad to see our team recommend that. I think that was the right response. Being a red team, we chose not to do that. It's not an expense we wanted to occur, though we have thought about doing that for exercise purposes. So we didn't let them do it, but we did let the red team keep their access, right? This is all about learning and education, so not the most authentic part in the world, but again, we want to get better, so we're going to do it. Okay, so the red team continued to expand their access, planning the attack. So they basically went silent for 3 months, continuing theme, right? Not something we can do in a normal engagement, but something a real attacker could do. They wanted to get people off their guard. They wanted people to relax a bit. They did absolutely nothing during this time period, which we were okay with. They planned a real straightforward attack against our Active Directory. And then this is real high level intentionally, but basically they used the tech support employee's credentials. That person had the ability to reset the credentials of others, part of their role, something they have to have. Forced a password change on user A that they identified in their kind of enumeration of Active Directory. User A owns the Active Directory object of user B. User B can functionally become domain admin. They executed the attack, and within 15 minutes, the domain was gone, right? They had domain access. I put hypothetically up there. It makes me feel better, but you know, I think y'all get the picture. When the red team was doing this, they shared with me a fun anecdote. We can coordinate via Slack, and they said, my hands are shaking. And so he was so nervous doing this because they've been at it for 3 years and hadn't had much success. And so, but they were successful in this attack, right? So 3 years, and they finally had domain admin. All right, what's the fallout look like? So the attack is detected via identity and access management alerts. Our identity and access management team reports to our technology folks. They got an alert that something strange had happened within Active Directory. They started to investigate. They talked to a user who said, it was probably my mistake. So painful. This user, they had been doing some work that day. They were real busy. They didn't know, and they just thought, hey, maybe I made a mistake and reset a credential when I didn't intend to. So our opportunity for detection was lost at this point. This turns into a huge win in the end, right? Because this employee, when they were told this, they're never going to make that mistake again, right? In terms of education, that is a huge win for that person. So there's the positive spin on it, but our opportunity for detection was missed. Teams would give it time for other detection mechanisms to function, but unfortunately, none do at this point. So the red team has achieved their objective functionally. So immediately, we switch gears to applying the lessons learned, right? So debrief, what happened, what did we miss? So the first thing we did is we pulled all the teams together and said, hey, you guys missed something, unfortunately, both our technology and security teams. We filled them in on the details, and then the next thing we did is we actually flew our red team partners in, and we had them actually have a debrief about pretty much a full day long with our teams where they said, show them everything we did from a red team perspective. Blue team gets the chance to ask questions. They get the chance to see everything firsthand and understand what occurred and what we missed. Then we get to start to talk about takeaways and how do we fix it and prevent it from happening again. Real collaborative conversation. A couple of just maybe warnings from my perspective. You get a lot of emotional reactions from this type of thing, right? So some of your folks are very angry with you for conducting a test like this. Some of your folks are real excited and they just want to learn all about it. So it kind of runs the range, and that's something to expect if you do something like this, is that you're going to get a lot of different reactions from folks. So some of the things we talked about with our folks, we lasted 3 years against a persistent attack. That's a fantastic thing, right? That's really hard to do, especially if someone is fully focused on breaching your organization. But phishing was effective, right? So what we always see and hear and preach, someone clicked on an email, and that's what burned us after 3 years of successful defense. And attackers never touched our endpoints, right? We probably had an over-reliance mentally on the strength of our EDR, hoping that it would be much more effective than it was. And it didn't play a role at all in this particular event. So something that the teams were kind of interested to hear. We did emphasize with our folks, the attack wouldn't have worked without seeded access, right? I talked at the beginning, no one's breached the environment externally authentically. It's important to emphasize these things for the kind of emotional well-being of your team, right? This is very stressful. If you've gone through this with your folks, even on a traditional red team, you'll know that as well, I think. We did identify about 20 specific takeaways to improve our controls. So we spent a lot of times with the team talking about different things. How can we get better? How can we do these things? And then we took about 2 to 3 months to implement those controls. So we applied a ton of different fixes. This is a very high priority project across the organization with both technology and security. And so we applied all those lessons learned. And at this point in the presentation, it's probably not going to surprise you, but we started again. So we have seeded access again to the red team, and they are currently, even today, in the process of seeing if they can breach our organization again. Part of that is validating some of the things we changed. Part of that is looking for things that are new and things we haven't tried before. So we're going to continue to do this. All right, so value proposition. Why do we prefer this style of red team? One of the things it's helped us with is that we know we can defend our environment for years against a persistent adversary. That's something that we've learned throughout this, right? Layers of control is super important, but we can be successful if we capitalize on those attacker mistakes. So the degree we can force mistakes from them and capitalize on that, excellent. Individual control layers can fail, but we can still have an effective program. Our teams have seen that firsthand, and they have a very kind of operational understanding of that as opposed to philosophical, right, or academic. It creates a constant pressure, too, to defend the environment. I think we've all probably been in conversations where, you know, technology or an IT stakeholder comes to you and says, like, hey, we just want to leave the system unpatched for like a month or something. And there's no opportunity to do that here because they know we're a bank, right? So if the red team breaks into that, you're going to be explaining what happened to our board functionally. And so it just changes the way people think, which I think is really important that we get that mindset shift, right, for employees. None of this is philosophical. None of this is, oh, it's happened in the news to other companies, but it couldn't happen here, right? It will happen here because we're paying someone to do it 24/7, 365. A couple of kind of just differences, I think, to contrast. Traditional red team's less expensive, no way around it, right? This is just going to be a more expensive way to run a test if you're doing it 24/7, 365. Traditional red teams are a little less disruptive. 2 weeks, maybe a month long, your folks are stressed out. They may be responding to red team attempts and that type of thing, but they're not always worried about that. And this does add a lot of stress to employees. There's no way around it, and I think you have to be deliberate about kind of acknowledging that and talking to your teams about it if you go down this path. Traditional red teams, I think there's little opportunity for customization or advanced targeting. You're not kind of held to the same, if you make a mistake on your perimeter, is someone going to capitalize on it? Maybe a real attacker, but you know, in a 2 to 3 week time period, it's just a little bit harder. And that kind of carries into the operational mistakes, right? You don't necessarily have to be perfect with the traditional red team. You just have to be good for 2 weeks. That's not how we operate, right? All of us want to learn from these types of things. It's just a reality of how the engagement functions. All right, continuous red team. Expensive, time-consuming, already kind of touched on that. It does, however, really force authentic incident response. So people are having to go back in the logs 3-6 months to try and understand an attack that occurred. That's a difficult skill set to operate or to exercise otherwise. And so I think that is a significant benefit, is you get much more authentic incident response, and your folks get real reps doing that, which I think is invaluable. They emulate persistent threats and adversaries better. The use of zero-day exploits is a real challenge for organizations to defend against, speaking from experience, and the time that they can take to plan and breach your organization is a compelling difference as well. So I think these are big wins for this type of engagement. And again, it really kind of changes the mindset of how employees operate. All right, how to implement. Find a vendor that matches your needs. I don't think I messed up and said my vendor that I'm using here, but go out and find one that does meet your needs. There's a couple that exist that do this type of testing. Evaluate them, see that you find the right one that's out there. Develop a communication structure. I think that's been super important. You're going to be in pretty much constant dialogue with your vendor or your red team on this, which adds to the time involved, right? But they're going to be talking to you about things they want to do or risks to your organization. Hey, if we try this, we might cause this operational problem. So you need a good communication structure established for this. Define the layers you want validated and those you're comfortable bypassing for the test. Again, I didn't want our mainframe tested. I had enough fun with that outside of red team exercises. So you want to think about that, right? What do we want the red team to actually try to do in our organization to confirm that our control layers are working effectively, and what are we comfortable bypassing? All right, with that, I'll open it up for any questions, if there are questions. Do you mind using the microphone? There's some folks that are, well, they're recording this as well. Sorry.
A couple of questions. One of them, you mentioned about the stress factor. How did you cope up with that? You know, keep up the motivation. So always looking back to the logs, and you know, we conduct red teams, and if they discover the red team, we don't tell them, but you know, they keep seeing things, and you know, generally our environment is clean and they understand something is happening, and we're not, alert because we know that it is the red team. But continuously you do it, is there a risk of, overburden or, a real attack, missing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a genuine risk that you can just increase burnout with your employees with this type of engagement. So some of the things we do is we make it a celebration, right, when they do catch the red team. So they, I think, enjoy that. They really feel successful. We make it as fun as we can in terms of, we also share a lot of anecdotes about how frustrated our red team gets when they get caught, and they legitimately are frustrated. So we make it kind of a friendly, competitive kind of atmosphere for it. The other thing we do is that we limit their authentic incident response to business hours, right? So if you detect red team activity, we're not going to tell you it's red team activity until 5 o'clock. And then we're going to say, hey guys, you've investigated for 4 hours, time to go home, disconnect, all that. And then we kind of also have to deal with employees just individually, one-on-one, just to see, some folks need some time off occasionally. Some folks are always good to go, and we just have to pull them back so they don't just get tired. But it runs a range, but it's definitely something to prepare for.
Okay, my second question is, how many man-days did the red team spend for, the first time and seated access and so on? How many man-days for them? I don't even ask for the blue team.
Yeah. In terms of the overall engagement, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit hard for us to tell sometimes because they do go back and they research things, and it's a little bit hard to know how much time they invest in that. But we tend to think they spend at least a week per month of kind of working hours targeting our environment at least. And then some of that's opportunistic, so if they see we make a mistake, they may get paged at 2 in the morning and spend 15 minutes trying to exploit something to see if the mistake was that egregious or whatever. So they do kind of have hours mixed in there as well. And
are you considering to, try with a different red team, alternate firms and so on?
Switching vendors and whatnot? Yeah, we're looking into that. There's not a ton of vendors in the space that do kind of exactly this model, so we're hopeful we don't have to change vendors, but we've been, I think, 3-4 years into this engagement, so for us, that's about time we would normally look for another vendor, so we will be soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
Good afternoon. So you had a infinite diagram there that kind of highlighted the red team, the blue team fighting and kind of tuning with each other's experiences. The countermeasure I'm curious to hear about is how much did the red team start dealing with false positives because they're being very aggressive in everything that they're looking and investigating, maybe creating a volume of investigative work that's overburdening, as he said, a burnout risk, because that's a balance, right? And they're in this paranoid state of we've got to catch these red team in our environment. That's the first question I'll maybe ask. I've got another one after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we do is we talked about that communication structure. Part of that is maintaining a lot of oversight as to what the red team's doing, because when we are kind of in that infinite cycle, I want them doing things that are emulating adversaries the right way, not just kind of throwing low-level commodity attacks against the wall. I don't want you just firing up Nmap and just scanning the whole environment and throwing a bunch of alerts that way. So a lot of it is making sure that we're getting quality response from different folks, or quality attack attempts from them. And it comes down to the personnel involved in that. So I think you need to know the people on your red team very well in terms of the actual people doing the testing so you can feel comfortable about bringing the right skill set. So to me, it comes down to their skill set.
Got it. Second question, you were engaged with the red team in the IoT example where you said they moved from a device just plugged in to an IoT. Did you learn from that some technology architecture changes and begin to apply them immediately, maybe segmenting out IoTs? Or do you let them just persist, knowing that that risk you're carrying aware in your environment for a period of time while the red team's doing the next phase of their attack?
Yeah, what you're describing, I think, is personally the most stressful thing for the engagement, which is deciding when you start to make changes based on what you're learning, even though the red team has not done necessarily what they've discovered. So we try and find that balancing act. And so I try and find natural stopping points for that, where the team has caught something, and then I can come back and say, okay, we've caught something. I talked to the red team is in agreement with me. We're going to disclose to you that we need to go segment all of these IoT devices off because they're way too accessible and that type of thing. So try and make it a dynamic conversation where I involve both the red team and then find a natural stopping point if I can. If something's bad enough, we're just going to fix it right away. But it's pretty rare.
Terrific session. How did you choose to or not to include third-party services in the tests?
We've been, unfortunately, careful not to include third-party services in the test, just because we don't a lot of times have the contract language that's necessary to go test those firms. The other thing that we've had to be conscious of is the red team has been very conscious of wiretapping laws and other things, especially when targeting IoT devices. Their lawyers feel like you get into really kind of gray territory very quickly. So depending on the capabilities of an IoT device, sometimes they themselves will rule that out of scope. So just a balancing act.
Hi, I'm curious about your threat hunting. So what was your effective in making your threat hunting? So changing like organization or like implementing like tools, something like that?
In terms of kind of just improving how we actually go about threat hunting for that activity?
Yeah.
So we went through a lot of different things. Some of it is just explicitly getting feedback from the red team, like, hey, here's a detection that we thought you guys would have in place that didn't work. But then one of the things we've learned is that we hired an FTE into a dedicated testing role now for us. And so that person's function is to basically go out and validate anything that we think is effective in our minds is no longer effective until someone has actually tested it and triggered it. So we spent a lot of time now having an FTE just go out and conduct different types of attacks to make sure that our Splunk rules are firing appropriately throughout that. So it comes down to that kind of cycle of forcing people to validate what they think is true. Early on in the engagement, we thought we had great rules implemented, but no one had ever really done the work to validate that. So that's now a continuous life cycle in the organization.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey there. How do you manage the both teams' motivation? I mean, you have a reward program for finding a breach or for manage a breach?
Yeah, for our teams, for our internal employees, we do patches. It's similar concept to challenge coins, right? So if someone has done a really fantastic job and they have a detection that, they wrote a new detection that caught the red team really, really quickly, we may kind of give them a challenge coin / patch, and that goes down pretty well with the teams. I also personally make a pretty big effort to recognize employees by name for with our board members, and so they get that recognition at a very high level of the organization. Then we come back to our teams and say, hey, I talked about so-and-so and how well they did to our board members. That type of thing resonates really well, but a lot of it is just kind of individual recognition and making sure that we recognize those individuals and talk about their accomplishments, and that works pretty well.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, if there's no other questions, I'll be hanging around for a little bit, so feel free to come chat with me, but thank you all, I appreciate it.